Hey, welcome back to Revenge Served by Karma. I'm Etta, and if you are new here, let me tell you exactly what kind of place this is. This is where the stories that kept you up at night finally get their endings. The real ones. The ones about ordinary people who got pushed too far, lied on, overlooked and underestimated, and then watched the truth show up right on time and change absolutely everything. We believe in one thing on this channel: you cannot outrun what you've done. Karma finds its address. It always does. So if you are ready for a story that is going to have you talking to your screen, grabbing somebody next to you, and sitting with your mouth open at the end, you are in exactly the right place. Make sure you are subscribed, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and let's get into it, because what happened in today's story? Nobody in that room saw it coming. I am Sarah Brooks. I still remember the exact moment my husband's world fell apart. It was a Sunday morning. The kind that feels ordinary right up until it isn't. The sun was coming through the kitchen windows, coffee was brewing, and Daniel was standing in front of the bedroom mirror trying to get his tie straight. The burgundy one. He had worn that same tie nearly every Sunday for 3 years because, in his words, there was nothing wrong with it and the money could go somewhere it was actually needed. I stood in the doorway watching him and thought what I had thought so many times before, that I had somehow ended up with the best man I had ever known. 4 hours later, I was sitting in the front pew of Cornerstone Community Church holding that same man's hand so tight my knuckles ached, while Elder Thomas Whitaker stood at the podium and told 400 people that my husband was not a man they could trust. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't even flinch. He walked up to that podium with his hands loose at his sides and looked out at the people he had spent 16 years loving, and he said 7 words. I trust God to make the truth plain. Then he came back and sat beside me, and I took his hand, and neither of us said a single word. What those 400 people didn't know, what I didn't even know yet, was that a man named Alexander Grant had been sitting in the 3rd row the entire time. He had driven 4 hours that morning. He had a document folded inside his jacket pocket. He had been waiting 3 weeks to use it. I have been married to Pastor Daniel Brooks for 19 years, and I want you to know who he is before I tell you what they did to him. Daniel grew up in a small house with his mother and 2 younger brothers. His father left when Daniel was 9, and he never once said that with bitterness, just said it the way you state a fact about the weather. He got his first job at 14, stocking shelves 3 evenings a week, and gave half of every paycheck to his mother without being asked. He told me that story on our 3rd date, not to make himself look good but because I had asked about his childhood and he saw no point in dressing it up. He became a pastor at 31. Not because it was safe or comfortable. Because he believed, and still believes, that people who are falling apart deserve someone willing to sit with them on the floor. In 16 years at Cornerstone, he never once asked for a pay raise he felt he hadn't earned. He showed up to hospital rooms at midnight. He drove elderly church members to their doctor's appointments on his days off. He counseled marriages that were barely holding together and never once made a family feel like a burden. And he paid people's bills. Quietly. From our own account. Utility bills mostly, electricity, water, for families in the congregation who were struggling. He never told me their names. Never told them where the money came from. When I eventually found out, I asked him why he hadn't at least told me. He looked genuinely confused by the question. Because then it stops being about them, he said. And it becomes about me. That was my husband. That was the man they put in front of 400 people and accused of stealing from the church. Elder Thomas Whitaker had been part of Cornerstone Community Church for 22 years. He was the kind of person who changed the energy of a room just by walking into it. Not because he was noisy or forceful, but because he carried himself like a man who had never once had to wonder whether his opinion mattered. He wore good suits. He spoke carefully. He had funded 2 overseas mission trips from his own pocket, chaired the building committee that grew the congregation from 80 members to over 400, and donated more money to the church than anyone could fully account for. By everything you could see on the surface, Thomas Whitaker was a pillar of that community. And I want to be honest, he had done real things. Given real time and real money. For a long stretch of years his ambitions and the church's needs pointed in the same direction, and the gap between them wasn't visible. Then the new building project came along. It was a big proposal. A new sanctuary. An outreach center. Expanded facilities that would genuinely serve the neighborhood. But it needed serious outside funding, and with that funding came outside donors. People with money and influence who would be looking closely at the leadership running the church before they committed to anything. Thomas started showing up to every donor meeting. He started framing everything around vision and growth and bold leadership. He used words like legacy and transformation. Daniel went to those same meetings and talked about the single mothers in the neighborhood. About teenagers who needed somewhere safe to go after school. About the specific families the outreach center was going to serve. I was at one of those meetings. I watched Thomas's face while Daniel was talking. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind. The whispers started in October, and I almost missed them entirely. The first sign was small. A woman named Carol, someone I had sat with over coffee after service more times than I could count, smiled at me in the parking lot one Sunday morning and kept walking before I could reach her. I told myself she was running late. The next Sunday, one of the deacons shook Daniel's hand but looked somewhere past his shoulder. By the third week, I knew something was moving through the congregation. I just couldn't see the shape of it yet. When I finally found out what the rumor was, from a friend who cared enough to tell me directly, it was about money. Specifically, a supposed discrepancy in the building fund. Nobody could say where the rumor started. It had no clear beginning, just a vague suggestion that the numbers didn't quite line up and that the pastor had access to those accounts and maybe someone ought to be asking questions. It was fuzzy enough that you couldn't knock it down quickly. Specific enough that it stuck. That's how these things work. They don't come straight at you. They come in sideways, through half-finished sentences and loaded pauses, until even the people who love you start looking at you just slightly differently and couldn't explain why if you ask them. Daniel felt it too. One evening he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and said quietly, "Something is happening, Sarah. I don't know what it is yet, but I can feel it." I told him he was just tired and needed rest. I have thought about that moment many times since then. I wish I had listened differently. The Sunday it happened was November the 3rd. The morning felt like any other. The worship team sang 3 songs. The announcements were read. Daniel had spent the whole week preparing a sermon from the Psalms, about trusting God in dark seasons. I had heard him practicing it out loud in his study the night before, his voice low and steady, the way it always was when he was working through something he genuinely believed. He never got to preach it. Before Daniel could even open his Bible, Thomas Whitaker stood up. He walked to the front of the sanctuary the way a man walks when he has rehearsed every step, unhurried, deliberate, certain. He asked for the congregation's attention and said that what he was about to share was hard but necessary. My stomach dropped before he said another word. He spoke for 7 minutes. I know because I fixed my eyes on the clock on the wall and kept them there, the way you grab onto something solid when the room starts tilting. He told the congregation that a financial review had turned up irregularities in the building fund. He said the amount was significant. He said that because the pastor had sole access to those accounts, the board had no choice but to call for an immediate suspension pending a full investigation. He said every word of it in the voice of a man doing something painful for the right reasons. The congregation went completely still. Then he looked at Daniel and asked him to come forward. Daniel stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to that podium with his shoulders straight and his face calm, and he looked out at 400 people. People whose mothers he had buried, people he had sat with through the worst nights of their lives, and he said 7 words. "I trust God to make the truth plain." Then he came back and sat beside me. I took his hand. The room buzzed around us, and somewhere behind me a woman was crying, and I stared at the cross on the wall, and I held on because one of us had to. We drove home without speaking. He went into his study and closed the door. I sat at the kitchen table and cried where he couldn't hear me. The days after the shaming were the hardest of our entire marriage. Not because Daniel was angry. He had every right to be furious, and he wasn't, and somehow that made it worse. Not because we argued, because we never did, not once. What made those days so heavy was watching the weight of it settle into him. Not all at once but slowly, the way water soaks into cloth, until you could see it in every part of how he carried himself. He stopped finishing his meals. He would sit down at the table and mostly just push food around his plate. He slept badly. I would reach across in the middle of the night and find his side of the bed empty, and I would find him in the living room in the dark, not praying out loud, not reading, just sitting there with his hands on his knees. What broke my heart the most was the self-questioning. Not the grief, not the exhaustion, the way he turned it inward. He would ask me, in a low and careful voice, whether he had been naive his whole ministry. Whether he had missed something fundamental in the people around him. Whether 16 years of giving everything he had to that congregation had been built on a misunderstanding of what God had actually called him to do. I didn't have answers that were good enough. So I just sat with him in it. Which was what he had always done for everyone else. Practically, it was serious. His salary was suspended the moment Thomas called for the investigation. Our savings were thin. We had never needed them to be deep, or so we had thought. I started quietly doing the math on what we could cover and for how long, and the numbers made me feel sick. 2 families from the church left bags of groceries on our front porch that week. No note. No knock on the door. Just food, left there. Daniel walked out and found the second bag and stood there looking at it, and then he sat down on the porch step and cried. I had not seen my husband cry in years. He still believed the truth would surface. He never stopped saying that. But there is a long distance between believing something and knowing it, and in those first dark days I could see that distance in his eyes every single morning when he woke up. Grace Mitchell came to our front door on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the public shaming. She was 26 years old. She had been attending Cornerstone for 4 years and sang on the worship team every other Sunday. She was not the kind of person Thomas Whitaker would have looked at twice. She was young, she kept to herself, and she had no standing in the formal structure of the church at all. She stood on our porch with her hands pressed together and her eyes red, and the first thing she said was that she was sorry for not coming sooner. I brought her in. Made tea. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table and she told us what she knew. 6 weeks before the public shaming, Grace had been working late in the church office. She handled part-time administrative work, mostly organizing the building fund correspondence with donors. That evening she had gone back to get something she had forgotten, and as she walked down the hall she heard voices coming from the conference room. The door was open just enough. She heard Thomas Whitaker. He was speaking to 2 other board members. And she heard him lay out a plan, specific, deliberate, to reclassify a set of personal expense reimbursements that he himself had authorized and received, moving them so they would appear as irregularities in the building fund account that Daniel managed. She had frozen right there in the hallway. She was a part-time administrator who needed that job to pay her rent. Thomas was connected and respected, and she was nobody in particular. She had spent 6 weeks trying to convince herself she had misheard or misunderstood. She hadn't misunderstood. She slid a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table. Notes she had written that same evening, word for word, with the date and time written at the top. Daniel studied it for a long moment. Then he looked up at her and said, "You know what this might cost you?" She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "But staying quiet was going to cost me more." 3 days after Grace came to our house, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. The number was from an area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was moving slowly that week, running on not enough sleep. Something made me pick up. The man introduced himself as Alexander Grant. He said he had been following what was happening at Cornerstone and that he needed to speak with Pastor Brooks as soon as he could. His voice was calm and measured. He sounded like someone who chose his words carefully and meant each one. I handed the phone to Daniel and watched his face. Something changed in it while he listened. Not dramatically. My husband was never dramatic. But something that had been pulled very tight in him for nearly 2 weeks started slowly to ease. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a moment without speaking. Then he told me who Alexander Grant was. 12 years ago, a young man from our neighborhood had walked into Cornerstone in a bad way. Drug addiction. A family situation that had fallen completely apart. No money, no job, nowhere steady to land. Daniel had spent 8 months with him. Counseling sessions, practical help, connections to a rehabilitation program, and money from our own household account that Daniel never mentioned to me at the time. That young man had put himself back together, went back to school, built a career, eventually built a business of his own. And he had never forgotten what Daniel had done for him, or the way it was done, without fanfare, without expectation, without ever once letting him feel small. He was 34 years old now. His name was Alexander Grant. Over the 12 years since, Alexander had become a genuine financial contributor to several church communities across the region. He sat on 2 nonprofit boards. He knew the donor group evaluating Cornerstone's building project personally. Weeks earlier, someone inside that donor group had flagged the financial irregularities to him directly, and when Alexander heard the details, they didn't line up with anything he knew about Daniel Brooks's character. So he had started asking questions. He had driven to that Sunday service to see the situation for himself. He was in the 3rd row when the shaming happened. He had watched Daniel stand at the podium and say 7 words with his hands still and his chin level. He had known then exactly why he had made the drive. What was folded inside his jacket pocket that morning was a financial audit he had privately commissioned and personally paid for, conducted by an independent firm that had gone through every transaction in the Cornerstone Building Fund for 3 full years. The results showed exactly what Grace had overheard in that hallway. The irregularities were real. Every single one of them. But none of them belonged to Daniel Brooks. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Monday morning. Thomas had requested it himself. He had spent the week working quietly, meeting privately with board members, shaping the narrative, positioning the meeting as the final formal step toward Daniel's permanent removal. He arrived that morning in his best suit with the posture of a man who believed he had already won. Daniel and I got there 10 minutes early. Our attorney, Tim, a quiet, thorough man who had spent the weekend going through every document twice, sat on Daniel's left. Grace was already there when we arrived, seated along the wall with her hands folded in her lap and her face holding the particular stillness of someone who has already decided to be brave and is just waiting for the moment. Alexander Grant walked in at 2 minutes before 9. Thomas saw him immediately. Something crossed his face, recognition first, then calculation, then a careful effort to look as if none of it mattered. The board chairman opened the meeting and invited Thomas to present. Thomas did it well. He was fluent and confident, walking the board through the discrepancies, the account access records, the timeline. It was polished. He had done this kind of thing before, in other rooms, with other people watching. When he finished, the chairman asked if there was a response. Daniel looked at Alexander. Alexander stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform anything. He just opened the folder on the table and walked the board through the independent audit, 1 page at a time, placing every figure Thomas had cited next to the verified transaction record underneath it. He showed them the reclassified reimbursements. He showed them the authorization signatures, Thomas Whitaker's own signature, on every one, dated and notarized. He showed the board a paper trail that was clear and complete and pointed in one direction only. Then Grace Mitchell picked up her folded piece of paper and read it aloud. Date, time, exact words spoken in that hallway 6 weeks before the public shaming. The room was absolutely silent. Thomas tried to speak twice. The first time nothing came out at all. The second time he started a sentence about context and misunderstanding and it fell apart before he got to the end of it. A board member named Deacon Patricia Howard, a woman who had been part of Cornerstone for 30 years, pushed her chair back slowly from the table. She looked at Thomas Whitaker for a long, steady moment. Then she turned to Daniel. I move, she said, that all charges against Pastor Brooks be dropped immediately, and that a full independent review of Elder Whitaker's conduct and finances be opened at once. Someone seconded it before she had even finished the sentence. The vote was 8-0. Thomas sat perfectly still while it happened. His suit was still pressed. His back was still straight. But the thing that had always animated him, the certainty, the assurance, the unquestioned belief that rooms like this one were his, had drained completely out of his face. What was left looked very small and very tired. Daniel did not look at Thomas when the vote was read. He looked across the table at Grace Mitchell. He mouthed 2 words. Thank you. 3 Sundays after the board meeting, Daniel walked back to the podium at Cornerstone Community Church. Same sanctuary. Same podium. Same congregation, mostly. Thomas Whitaker was not there. He had resigned from every church position the morning after the board meeting. His statement to the congregation had been brief and carefully written and had not included the word sorry anywhere in it. That was between him and God, as far as Daniel was concerned. My husband would never have demanded an apology, and everyone who knew him understood why. I sat in the front pew with my hands in my lap and watched Daniel walk to the front of the room. The congregation was quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. The kind of quiet that means people are paying attention with something deeper than their ears. Some people were already crying before he said a word. The woman who had walked past me in the parking lot 2 months earlier, without stopping, was sitting in the third row with her hand over her mouth and her eyes fixed on my husband. Daniel placed his notes on the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He stood there for a moment just looking out at the room. Then he said, "I want to start this morning by thanking 2 people who taught me something I honestly should have already known." He thanked Grace Mitchell. He said her name out loud in front of everyone, and he said that what she had done had required a kind of courage that most people go their entire lives without being asked for, and that she had found it anyway. He said Cornerstone was a different place because of her. He thanked Alexander Grant, who was back in the third row, same seat as before, and Daniel said only that some debts can never really be repaid, and that the fact that certain people try anyway is one of the most quietly remarkable things about being alive. Then he opened his Bible to the passage in Psalms he had prepared for November the 3rd and never gotten to deliver. The one about trusting God in the middle of darkness. He preached it like a man who no longer needed to take it purely on faith. He preached it like someone who had walked through the thing the psalm describes and come out the other side still standing. I sat there in that front pew and listened to every single word. When he reached the last verse, I felt something release in my chest, something that had been wound tight for 2 months, and I let it go. After the service, a teenage boy named Marcus, someone Daniel had been quietly mentoring for 3 years, walked up to him in the aisle. Marcus was not an expressive kid. He didn't usually say much. He just walked up and put his arms around Daniel and held on. Daniel held on too. For a long time. I stood there watching them and I thought about all of it. The dark living room at 3 in the morning. The grocery bags on the porch. Grace's folded piece of paper sliding across our kitchen table. Alexander Grant picking up a phone early on a weekday morning because a man who had helped him 12 years ago, quietly and without keeping score, needed someone to show up. I thought about how close we had come to losing everything. And I thought about what had actually saved us. Not some dramatic stroke of justice falling from the sky, but ordinary people deciding, one at a time, that the truth was worth the cost of telling it. The building project moved forward. 6 months later the funding came through, in large part because Alexander connected the donor group to the new vision for the outreach center. In its first year, that center served 112 families in the neighborhood. Grace Mitchell was offered a full-time position as church administrator. She said yes. And on the Sunday mornings that came after all of it, the ordinary ones with sunlight through the kitchen windows and coffee on the stove, I would watch Daniel knot his tie in front of the bedroom mirror and hum something under his breath, and I would feel the full weight of how close we had come. Not because evil is more powerful than good, but because good people sometimes wait too long to speak. The ones who didn't wait, Grace, Alexander, Deacon Patricia, that is why this story ends the way it does. Never underestimate what one person telling the truth at the right moment can do. It can give a man his life back. It can give a community its soul back. Sometimes it can remind you, after everything, why you believed in people in the first place. And that right there is why I do this. Not just for the satisfaction of watching truth win. Though I will be honest with you, that part never gets old. But because every single one of these stories carries the same reminder underneath it. Your character is being written in the quiet moments. In the moments when you think nobody important is watching. In the choices you make when it costs you something to make the right one. Grace chose truth when it could have cost her everything. Alexander showed up for a man who had shown up for him 12 years earlier without keeping score. And Daniel? Daniel just kept being exactly who he was, even when everything around him was falling apart. That is not weakness. That is the kind of strength that holds. If this story moved you, and I hope it did, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave me a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest, because I read every single one and your words genuinely mean something to me. New stories every week, right here. I am Etta, and I will see you in the next one. Remember, karma always finds its way home.